Hey everyone.
Hello.
Good.
We're on that Canadian show with our toques.
Yes.
No, you know why we're all here.
Yeah. We were inspired. Well, at least I was inspired to put on a toque this evening toboggan.
And she inspired me to put mine on
Yes.
too. So.
I tend to be cold, and then talking about endurance, reading about it, the book, can make me colder. And so here we are.
In kind of a video installment, I think this is the second talking about the book Endurance, and hopefully people have had a chance to either join in on some of the Zoom calls with church or attend the campfire event. And I think what did we find out that
The best part really of all of this is the opportunity for fellowship. So
yeah.
For us, we love the opportunity to even feel like we're connecting with people when we record these videos, whether it's on a Monday night or this is a Thursday evening. But we partly missed Monday because we wanted to be in person around a fire, and got to do that with some folks from our congregation. Some had read the book, some hadn't, but yeah, we wanted to be with each other is what we found out, and got to talk about endurance. And so
there's a part of me actually that thinks that the only reason they have us doing these videos is just for you and me.
Works for us.
Yeah, it is. It's totally good.
So if you're watching, totally thanks.
Got to keep the painters doing something.
So yeah, if you're reading, that's super. As we mentioned in the first video, we're not going to be reading word for word the entire book just because it is a longer book, and it would be too much to try to attempt to do. If you haven't started, don't feel like you can't still get a copy, and the church would be happy to help provide one for you. So just let somebody know. And whether or not you read, you can tune in these videos. Part of what we decided, we just want to try to give people a feel for the book and kind of a summary of what's going on, highlight some excerpts, talk about some things we're learning outside of a little extra research we're doing, and you can be part of the conversations by Zoom or I think the next one's the first week of February. If you want to check the announcements, and you can just let them know you want to sign up for those.
But do be aware, you don't have to read the book to join in on and to even think about endurance. Part of where we're going to even start thinking about tonight is if anyone knew anything about endurance, it was Jesus and the early church. So, and our church now, as we're enduring being apart, we're enduring the threat of this looming virus, a vaccine. We've endured an election season that was particularly tense and volatile. Yeah, a tightrope, kind of, if you will. So there's lots of things that we as a church are enduring. So I think that the title is definitely apt. Thankfully, he wasn't the first person to use this word. So But I'll start just by briefly talking about part one of this book, because that is part of what we were kind of thinking we'd do with the video series. And in part one, we're introduced immediately to a book and to a ship called Endurance. And again, just briefly, pass me the globe.
And where on earth is this taking place, Rob?
So in the early part of the 20th century, again, we're talking about explorers in this time when taking the call, I think, of Adam and Eve to subdue the earth. And in this time period, they hadn't, ventured everywhere, and there were all these conquests, and these actually continue. And if you think about, this is the land of Britain, who were conquerors, and all the countries were trying to conquer, and there were fish, and this boat was actually made in the Netherlands for whaling expeditions to take rich people up in this time period in the early 20th century to whaling expeditions. And the boat was actually made in Norway. And then this Ernest Shackleton purchased the boat and had it renamed Endurance. And that was his expedition, was to take off from here, and he actually sailed over to cross the equator, sails over to meet the rest of his shipmates in Buenos Aires, Argentina, and they're going to sail to this island in South Georgia where there was a permanent whaling station, where actually, really coolly, in 1909, the largest whale ever caught was 109 feet long, and it was caught at this station in South Georgia Station, which is a prominent place. So they go here, they decide that they get held up here longer than they had hoped, and they start off to sail. And by this time, Ernest is thinking that, our Captain Shackleton is thinking that the journey's going to take longer. His whole goal was to land in this part of Antarctica and walk across it to this part of Antarctica, which is the Ross Bay, or the Ross team was going to meet them there, and they were going to include in that trek. So they take off from this island and quickly encounter pack ice, and the ship becomes stuck. And that's where we start in this part one. And by the ice just floating in this water, and because of wind, it rotates. And so the ship gets stuck here, and it finally doesn't sink until it's been stuck in the ice until about here. And the ship finally sinks. And that's the end of part one of the book.
Yeah, it actually hasn't sunk yet. It's they finally had to abandon the ship because the ice packs were putting so much pressure on the ship that it was causing it to actually splinter in places, and
we don't need the globe anymore. I'll get rid of that.
So at the very end of part one, you hear the statement that they started part one with, which was, "She's going, boys."
I think it's time to get off.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And that's where part two picks up. So they have abandoned the ship and are about to decided to abandon and seek refuge on the ice itself. So I think I wanted to start a little bit because you were talking about, just the value of us thinking about endurance, kind of wherever, with all these world events going on, but also probably most everyone that's part of these discussions or listening is thinking in their own lives about just things that have been really hard personally, in family or with health, or maybe you have something in your background. I mean, there's lots we've had to endure, and you and I were just talking about how we tend to want to those seem like aberrations to us a lot of times. Like life should be a certain way. It should be generally good, smooth. When something bad happens, it's like the thing that stands off the plan, and we need to get things back to the plan. And I think part of what we were talking about is actually helpful from the verse that if you're in these discussions, there's a few verses that have been shared with us, but one of the verses comes from Hebrews 12, 1 through 2, and I'm just going to read it. It says, "Therefore, since we are surrounded by so great a cloud of witnesses, let us also lay aside every weight and sin which clings so closely, and let us run with endurance the race that is set before us, looking unto Jesus, the author and perfecter of our faith, who for the joy that was set before him endured the cross, despising the shame, and is seated at the right hand of the throne of God." Right? And
there's a lot.
It's a lot, right? I mean, we could talk for the next 45 minutes about this particular passage. So we endure things Um, and as Rob mentioned earlier, we have a God, the God who knew before that globe, the world was created, right? That what he would have to endure for us to know him, and that would include um, him joining us in all of this and enduring much of what we know, right? The pain, the sorrow. You were just reading about him weeping at Lazarus's death this week, and John, we were talking about that, and that he endured all of that and joined our humanity because he is a God that loves us where we are and says, I know your pain and I love you in it, and one day there will be no tears.
Right.
But there are tears now, and that's part of life. And so one of the questions that Jen Sanders posed around this verse was that we have to think about the therefore whenever there's a therefore, and a passage starts with that. And so you kind of want to think about, well, something must have come before that whole passage to set up this therefore. And we're not going to read all of Hebrews 11, but I would encourage you to read Hebrews 11 because it's an account, essentially, this synopsis of the history of the people of God, from Cain and Abel, sons of Adam and Eve, all the way through the patriarchs of the Old Testament, the liberation of the Israelite people from Egypt, and all of these people. And the one phrase that goes throughout the whole 40 verses of chapter 11 is by faith, by faith, by faith Abraham, by faith Moses, by faith. They did something. It wasn't because of them just getting up enough courage to make things happen, and they placed their faith in the one who is always faithful and
true.
Yeah, right.
It's like one thing that's striking is that like again, we're undone when things. Oh, I've got all these great plans for my life, and we're undone when those things don't go as expected. But Jesus is actually telling us the truth. Things aren't going to go as you expect. But I am faithful. So it's like, he's the truth teller.
Right.
He is telling you you're going to suffer. That's not a lie. And it's also not just Christians who are going to suffer. Life is hard. So it truly is this, the truth of God coming for us and letting us know. But if you, like the patriarchs, have faith. And
there were a lot of women that did too, as well. Rahab was one I remember.
Yes.
Sarah. So
and Sarah.
That's right. So and so it's kind of this beautiful thing too. At the very end, he says, by faith, those people didn't actually see the completion of what would have been promised, because they did not live in the time when Jesus had come and lived and died and been raised from the dead, and we are living in that time, and it's that hard place of he's completed the work. We know that he's the victor. We still struggle in life. He wants us to develop this endurance for our good and for his glory, while also trusting that he's got it ultimately. But it is this beautiful thing too of remembering our past, like of the history of mankind in the Old Testament and in the New Testament, and then also these lovely and hard stories that we have, like the story of this crew that experienced something most of us would never really desire to experience, probably.
Right.
So
this is about as much hat as I want to wear.
Right. So the other lovely part, Rob, of that verse, and then we will move on, although I don't feel bad talking about this for a long time, but
God's word.
Yeah. But he says that who for the joy that was set before him endured the cross. And you just pointed out a few times that we've been thinking about this, that like we are part of that joy.
That's right. That's right. Yeah.
I won't steal your.
No, it's not. It is the beauty of that. It's kind of easy to read over. For the joy set before him, was that something that was that God's face? No, it included us. Like we are part of that joy. Him saving the humanity he created. Mm-hmm. That is part of the joy that was set before him. And for which he endured the cross. So that smile as we navigate our own ice flowed in ships and sinking ships, that saving us, and in helping us endure through those things is part of the joy that was set before him. I always like to think about that conversation, before they spoke the Trinity, before they spoke into creation, over the chaos, and it describes that. But, before that, God knew what he was getting into, and in the conversation of the Trinity, that idea that what this is going to cost us, and let's do it so that I can see you, our church, because I'm going to see them. So we're entering this, and that's what's going to happen. So we'll stop, I guess.
This is us talking, by the way. You won't read any of this in the actual book. It's not in the book. It's not. Although it is lovely. I've the very first excerpt that the very first part of part 2 actually is an inscription that the Queen Mother Alexandra of England actually wrote in the Bible that she gave to the expedition before they left on this journey.
So it's really kind of cool that that's the way things happened. Like the government, the king, queen of Britain at this time was sending them forth with the state. They're christening, they're blessing the trip.
Yeah.
Which is just a neat thing to think about. And so that's when this happened. She gave him a Bible.
Yeah. And she says, this is what she wrote: "May the Lord help you to do your duty and guide you through all the dangers by land and sea. May you see the works of the Lord and all his wonders in the deep." It makes me wonder how he read that, or how any of the crew members read that when they first were setting off, and then months later when they were stuck in ice for months, and then months later when they were on a boat trying to make it. Yeah. But may you see the works of the Lord and all his wonders. And that's a lovely prayer, actually.
It is.
So
you're going to read something?
I thought I'd read a little bit more of just to get a set in the part 2 where they are, because we'll get a good sense of like what's going on with the crew. So these words were written on the flyleaf of a Bible given to the expedition by Queen Mother Alexandra of England. Shackleton carried the Bible in his hand as he left the Endurance. This is right after they've decided to abandon ship, and walked slowly across the ice toward the campsite. The others hardly noticed his arrival. They were busy crawling in and out of the tents, trying numbly to create some degree of comfort with what energy remained in them. Some arranged pieces of lumber to keep themselves off the snow-covered ice. Others spread pieces of canvas as ground covers. But there was not enough flooring for everybody, and several men had to lie directly on the bare snow. It made little difference. Sleep was all that mattered, and they slept, most of them embracing their nearest teammates to keep from freezing. We've wondered that many times reading, like they were always wet, they were always cold.
Yeah.
Temperatures at negative 20, a warm day was anything above 0. yeah, so that it's remarkable that
I can't fathom that
more feet
idea.
weren't lost. Shackleton did not even try to sleep. He paced continually around the floe. If you're joining in, the floe is this large floating piece of ice.
It's a single piece of ice. It would be an old piece of ice that they could actually see the edges of, and so that would be called a floe.
And sometimes they were 6 feet thick, and sometimes they were much thicker.
They were generally thicker. Yeah, thick enough. Really thick ice that was sturdy. Obviously.
So that's their campsite, surrounded by
it's a piece of ice.
Water.
I mean, that's.
The pressure was still intense. This is the pressure of the floes
pushing
against each other. And several times the campsite sustained a violent shock. The dark outline of Endurance 200 yards away rose against the clear night sky. About 1 a.m., as Shackleton walked back and forth, there was a jolt. Then a thin, ribbon-like crack snaked across the floe among the tents. Almost immediately, it began to widen. Shackleton hurried from tent to tent, waking the exhausted sleepers. It required an hour's tricky work in the dark to transfer the camp to the larger half of the floe. I'm sure they were like, "You got to be kidding!"
Yeah. But these weren't like a ragtag bunch of guys.
Yeah.
This was. They were seamen, and they were all trained. Shackleton again had like 5,000 people apply for these 27 spots, and they had one stowaway. But that stowaway was a good friend of one of these guys, so they all knew somewhat what they were getting into.
And that it would be a year or longer. Yeah. Thereafter, all was quiet in the camp, though just before dawn there was a loud report from the Endurance. Her bowsprit and jib boom had broken and dropped onto the ice. For the rest of the night, Shackleton could hear the ghostly rhythm of the chain from the martingale boom being slowly dragged back and forth by the movement of the ship. I don't know what all those things are, but I can imagine the eeriness of that sound. When morning came, the weather was dull and overcast, but the temperature had climbed to 6 above zero. Soared. The men turned out stiff and cold from sleeping on the ice. It took a very long time for them to wake up. Shackleton did not press them, and after a time they turned to the job of sorting out equipment and stowing it securely on the sledges. It was a quiet time, and very few orders were given. Everyone understood his job and went about it without having to be told. The plan, as they all knew, plan number, I don't know, there's lots of plans.
Unscripted plan.
Was to march toward Paulette Island, 346 miles to the northwest, where the stores left in 1902 should still be. So an expedition had been attempted in that year, right? But it wasn't successful. And so they had left a bunch of goods there that they knew they could use for survival. Are you finding Paulette Island?
It's not named on this, but you can get an idea. The boat, they abandoned the ship in this area, and one of these islands here on this kind of chain, and they're all in this Weddell Sea. So they're going to march. They're going to try and get to one of these islands somewhere in this chain here.
Just 346 miles.
Yeah. on an ice floe.
To give you a sense,
floating ice floe.
The next sentence does say the distance was farther than from New York City to Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, and they would be dragging 2 of their 3 boats with them, since it was assumed that they would eventually run into open water. So then they go on to talk about, they start mounting the whaler and one of the cutters onto sledges. These are the boats. The boats with their sledges would weigh more than a ton apiece, and nobody had any delusions that it would be easy to drag them over the chaotic surface of the ice, with its pressure ridges occasionally 2 stories high. Nevertheless, there was a remarkable absence of discouragement. All the men were in a state of dazed fatigue, and nobody paused to reflect on the terrible consequences of losing their ship. Nor were they upset by the fact that they were now camped on a piece of ice perhaps 6 feet thick. So this must be a less thick one than some of the others. It was a haven compared with the nightmare of labor and uncertainty of the last few days and the endurance. It was quite enough to be alive, and they were merely doing what they had to do to stay that way. And I think that's part of what's remarkable throughout this. But I think too about our own lives, or people I've known that have gone through really hard things, and you think it can get worse, and then it gets worse, and then you think you can't survive, and then you figure out how to, and then you're just glad to be alive, and anything's better than what was before, and so, but there's this beautiful characteristic of resiliency that God gave. I mean,
in His
image,
yeah,
right?
It is. It's
really lovely. We talk about it with newborn babies even a lot, and what they can handle. It's really, really sweet. So we basically, that's kind of the situation. And they start working. Shackleton decides, to skip down just a little bit about the packing of the sledges. Shackleton called all hands together, and sledges are like the sleds.
It's basically a sled. Yeah.
But the dog team.
The dog team can pull. You've kind of seen that, right?
And Shackleton's face was grave. He explained it was imperative that all weight be reduced to the barest minimum. Each man, he said, would be allowed the clothes in his back, plus 2 pairs of mittens, 6 pairs of socks, 2 pairs of boots, a sleeping bag, a pound of tobacco, and 2 pounds of personal gear. Speaking with the utmost conviction, Shackleton pointed out that no article was of any value when weighed against their ultimate survival, and he exhorted them to be ruthless in ridding themselves of every unnecessary ounce, regardless of value. After he had spoken, he reached under his parka and took out the gold cigarette case and several gold sovereigns and threw them into the snow at his feet. And this is really interesting. Then he opened the Bible Queen Alexandra had given them and ripped out the flyleaf and the page containing the 23rd Psalm. He also tore out the page from the book of Job with this verse on it. Out of whose womb came the ice, and the hoary frost of heaven, who hath gendered it? The waters are hid as with stone, and the face of the deep is frozen. He laid the Bible in the snow and walked away. So apparently he was dramatic. It was sometimes,
Sure.
And it was a dramatic gesture. But whatever his reasoning in that, it's still the verse in Job is still proclaiming, like, who is God but God?
Yeah.
Who did all of this but
Yeah.
God? It's like the stones will keep crying out. So,
right. I tell them to be quiet, the stones will cry out. That's still the refrain.
And we won't read this section just because it, and all of the hardship they endure. This is probably the saddest part, but on the next page is where some of the dog teams had puppies in the months that they'd already been on the ship, and Shackleton, of course, says, well, we can't feed any mouth that isn't helping, isn't working. And so he commands that some of the puppies be disposed of. And there's just a touching scene of one of the men who was really attached to one of the puppies who had to walk off and shoot his dog. And many of us are pet owners and have dogs. And just this striking thing, though, because especially in light of us talking about how much they can endure, it stood out as like one of the saddest events that occurred.
Well, just not the willingness, but the harsh reality. And maybe there's another part of the lesson there, the harsh reality that their survival required that sacrifice. In terms of they couldn't feed it.
Right.
They couldn't afford to take the food, and it couldn't do what it wasn't working. So
right.
Just wasn't part of their plan. It was almost like the gold.
Then there's lots you can read. The next part we was thinking about was on page 88. And it's a section. It starts with it's basically the last couple paragraphs of this chapter, Um, and if you want to read it, Rob, if you wouldn't mind, but I think the first line is striking and would probably lend itself to some conversation, because these men are still camped on this piece of ice, waiting for the winds and the weather and the currents, right, to move them somewhere.
Mm-hmm. Is everything? Is that where you were
Mm-hmm.
playing? Everything depended on the drift of the pack. The ice might continue to go generally northwest, carrying them toward Palmer Peninsula, possibly as far as the South Orkney Islands, some 500 odd miles to the north. Or the drift might be arrested for some reason, and they would remain more or less in the same spot. Finally, the pack might veer northeast or even east, carrying them away from land. Whatever happened, January would mark the point of no return. If the drift was toward land, they should have enough open water by then to launch the boats and make for the most promising spot. It seemed reasonable in theory, at least. If the pack were to stop moving, that fact would be apparent by January. Then, rather than spend the winter camped on the ice, the party would abandon their boats except for a small punt the carpenter had built and make a dash for the nearest land, using the punt to ferry across any open water they ran into. It would be a risky business, but better than wintering on the ice. The third prospect was grim indeed. If the pack drifted northeast or east, and if they were unable to launch the boats, they would have to spend winter adrift on the floes, somehow surviving the polar night with its paralyzing cold and violent storms. If this were to happen, they would know by January, and there would still be time to lay in meat to see them through. But nobody even cared much to think about such a possibility. And keep in mind, when he's saying January, so
yeah,
our winter solstice is December 21st.
Mm-hmm.
That would be the summer solstice for the Antarctic. So he's saying shortly after that, by January, they will know what summer is going to look like, and it's either going to open the ice and let them see land. But it's a fascinating picture of that geography of the world and the ice movement and flowing through there, just like you would see ice on throw ice cubes in a bucket and blow on it and watch. I mean, that's basically what they were doing. It's just a fascinating picture of being at the risk of that, or they're at God's mercy, right?
Well, and at that point too, they had they had written in some of the preceding pages about how they kind of settled into camp life on the ice, and they were finding ways to pass the time, and it wasn't so bad once you get used to it. And
they were exercising the dogs. I mean, they were running them around the edge of the flow, and keeping hope.
Right.
They weren't twiddling their thumbs.
And it just struck me in rereading, and especially this where it said everything depended on the movement of the ice, that in a lot of ways this is a really good picture of how we live life. Like, we tend to set up what we think are these really, really stable lives, right? Like, okay, well, I'll get settled in myself, and I'll get my education or my job or my career. I'll get my relationships in order. I'll get my family. I'll do all the things, and I'll be solid and I'll be secure. And yes, God's maybe in there, but like we don't actually recognize that we're on some pretty solid ice. But he is the movement. Like, he is going to send us northeast or west, or we can fight all we want, but we can only go so far if he wants us to be somewhere else. And so it's this and that actually our lives are more full. There's more danger, not in a scary way, but in like there are going to be 2-story drifts to get over, and cracks that could suddenly come up, and that part of like that development of endurance is like, how are we going to actually anticipate and even welcome these hard things, as an opportunity to rely on him. And
yeah.
and so we're not like there's no part of us that wants to like offer a prescription for
Right.
like here's how you become a person of endurance. But at the same time, we do feel like that like, well, I think we all know this, right? When things are hard, what do we tend to fall back on? Is it that we're praying? Is it that we're seeking truth? Is it that we're relying on conversation with folks who know truth that are reminding us of that when we can't? And that the more we're practicing and living that in our regular lives, and we were kind of talking about this with even like some conflict management, like and with like marriage counseling, that
right, that if you're building these habits to converse, then you can do them when
and to listen
conflict
yeah
comes up. Yeah. And that's clearly what these men had done, right? I mean, in the first passage you were reading, it's like everyone went about what they were needed to do
right
without even being told, because they had that habit. And so our endurance, back to Hebrews, in trusting and having faith, and is building character, and that's part of the Roman verse too.
Yeah. Oh, and that actually fits in really well. So you said that the men were prepared, and in fact, when let's see, so they decide, so their ice floe deals with some more pressure, but they remain undamaged. The flow is undamaged. This is the beginning of chapter 4, if you're trying to follow along at all.
Part 2, chapter 4.
Part 2, chapter 4. It says, Shackleton, who did not want a false sense of security to develop among the men, issued an emergency stations bill on November 15. Unlikely as escape was, every man was assigned a specific duty in case the party should suddenly have to strike camp. If the route was to be over the ice, the sledge drivers would harness their teams with all possible speed while the other men gathered stores and equipment, struck the tents, and then stood by the edges. Or if, as they hoped, they could escape by water, they were to ready the boats. So that, I think we often have a false sense of security. And I mean, some of that's been disrupted with life and the pandemic.
Right.
And maybe in a...
Yeah, the very beginning of this, we weren't even secure about our toilet paper.
Right. Yeah.
Better go get some.
So just having, so the fact that they like were prepared for when they knew they might have to, the ice is cracking, we better get going, was part of why they survived, So, and I thought about reading some, I mean, this is, there's a section here, I don't know how much, time-wise we might want to read, but there's some here where they just talk about what camp was like on the ice floe. I thought it might be, again, if you're just listening and want a few excerpts, to hear kind of what these guys did living on an ice floe all day. You want to pick up and read? But it was impossible. So they talk about these emergency plans, and then they say it's also hard not to be complacent when you're sitting there.
But it was impossible to prevent a certain amount of complacency, as the men became increasingly accustomed to the well-established day-in, day-out routine of camp life. The line of pale green tents seemed now almost as familiar as the ship had been. 2 of the tents were the conventional sort, with a bamboo pole in the center. The others, the hoop tents designed by Marston for the expedition, operated on the same principle as the sunshade on a baby carriage, and they could be set up or struck in a matter of seconds. Their ability to weather storms, however, was not equal to that of the center pole variety. Each day in camp, at 6:30 a.m., when the night watchman drew off a tablespoon of gasoline from a drum in the gallery and poured it into a small iron saucer in the bottom of the stove, he then lighted the gasoline, and it, in turn, ignited strips of blubber draped on grates above the saucer. Hurley had fashioned the stove from an old oil drum and cast iron ash chute taken from the ship. The stove sat in the center of the galley, which itself was a little more than a makeshift windbreak, constructed of spars driven into the ice, over which pieces of sail had been stretched and lashed in place.
These are the original MacGyvers.
Yeah, they were. The galley also served as the library, and the few books that had been salvaged from the Endurance were kept there in plywood packing cases. In addition, a chronometer hung on one post, a mirror on another. As soon as the stove was burning, the night watchman awakened Green to begin breakfast. By 7 o'clock, the men had begun to emerge from their tents to relieve themselves off behind some nearby hummocks. Many carried frayed toothbrushes, and on their way back, they paused to clean their teeth with the snow. The heavy sleepers, who were not up by 7:45, were awakened by the night watchman, who went among the tents shouting, "Lash up and stow!" The men rolled up their sleeping bags and sat down on them to wait for breakfast. Sometimes seal steak, sometimes canned fish, sometimes porridge or pemmican and tea. After breakfast, the men went about their customary chores. Green spent the morning making bannocks. These were lumps of fried flour, frequently mixed with dog pemmican or lentils or anything that would give them some flavor. And there was always ice to be melted into water. Old Chippy McNeish usually assisted McLeod. Howe and Bakewell spent these days raising the sides of the whaler and one of the cutters to make them as seaworthy as possible. So they were adding on parts to the top of the boat to give them a little bit more water protection. However, they were hampered by a shortage of both tools and of materials. Only a saw, a hammer, a chisel, and an adze had been salvaged. And McNish had obtained a few nails by pulling them one by one out of the superstructure of the Endurance.
I guess there was the part where they kept making trips back to the ship as it wasn't sinking quickly, and to get whatever they could out of it. So
yeah, it turns out to be this really beautiful picture. Read ahead of the ice rotating and like them trying to move but not getting very far because all of the ice. It's almost like they run from the ship, but the ship kind of almost keeps up with them a little bit.
Interesting. Okay.
In that flow.
Yeah.
So they do have to go back to it, but it's not as far as you think, and so it's kind of funny. So that does come back in the end. It's this giant blessing. Hurley, too, was busy preparing for the boat journey.
He's the photographer.
He was not only an excellent photographer, but a skilled tinsmith as well. And he knew how to work fashioning a primitive boat pump from a tube-like portion of the ship's compass binnacle. Yeah, so he's soldering. I mean, the things that they were doing, First of all, I won't give you the end, but they start the stove with gasoline.
Sail blubber, right?
And then that starts the sail blubber to burning, to cook everything that they've got. But, yeah. Needless to say, OSHA wasn't around. The rest of the party spent their time hunting. Most of the men went out in pairs to look for seals, while the dog drivers exercised their teams around the floe. Often, while they were exercising the dogs, the drivers would see one of the hunting parties in the distance waving a small flag, the signal that a seal had been sighted. One of the teams would then go and bring in the carcass. Killing a seal was usually a bloody business. Wild had brought from the ship a revolver, 12-gauge shotgun, and a .33 caliber rifle, but ammunition was limited. As a result, they tried to do this all by hand whenever possible. And so that involved just approaching the animal and stunning it with a ski and then cutting its neck so that it would just bleed to death.
Yeah.
And then they actually collected the blood and fed that to the dogs. But most often it just ran out in the snow. And so they were trying also to save everything. So it was important to not maul the animal as well, because they would eat every bit. They talk about eating the brains for the high vitamin content. In the beginning, some seemed a little squeamish about this method of hunting, but not for long, because they're talking about their survival. It's when back in chapter 1, when Shackleton found the stowaway, he joked that, okay, you can stay, but if anything happens, you're the first one we eat, right? So, they all understood. Everyone chuckled and thought that was a great joke that he had made. So, after lunch, which usually consisted of a bannock or two, which were those fried flour things, and some jam and tea, and then they would go and strengthen all the harnesses around and repack equipment and help with the boats. Fed the dogs at 5 o'clock in the afternoon while they were barking, and then ate dinner at 5:30, which was seal hoosh, was like their blubber mixed together and not this great tasty stuff.
They all learned to eat it though.
Yeah, they all did. They all learned to eat it. Then they had all been split up in tents, and Shackleton, they would play poker or patience or bridge with cards.
Yeah, I think bridge became the big game.
And then they would sit around yarning, telling stories, and interestingly, like they liked the books. I mean, that would be, can't imagine, it'd be like hanging out in basically a little larger than a football field size piece of ice that you're just thankful isn't doing anything but always on edge about it cracking.
Right.
And having to move to one side or the other, and then hearing all of this stuff. And in January at this point in time, the sun was just rotated in the sky. It stayed above and then would start to go away. And I guess by March, it's gone. Totally. So.
For the polar night, right? They call it. Yeah.
Right. Until, next September,
yeah.
I think. So, just craziness. But was there another place?
Yeah. Well, at the very end, because we pretty much were at the end of the day, right? They talk, lights go out.
Yeah.
And usually by 10, everything's quiet. They did talk about how dark their faces were from the fire and the blubber cooking.
Very, very ashy, Which you can only imagine was also on the food, right? They're eating food.
Right. The last part's worth reading because it's when the ship goes. It's so early in the morning of November 21st, a salvage party went back to the ship. They noticed that the floes which had driven into the sides of the ship were moving slightly. They returned to camp and were unharnessing and feeding the dogs when Shackleton came out to watch. He was standing close to Hurley's sledge. It was 4:50 p.m. Out of the corner of his eye, he noticed the ship move. He turned quickly and saw her stack disappear behind a hummock. "She's going, boys!" he shouted, and dashed up the lookout tower. A moment later, all hands were out of the tents and scrambling to gain a vantage point. They watched in silence. Away from the pack, the stern of the Endurance rose 20 feet into the air and hung there for a moment with her motionless propeller and her smashed rudder held aloft. Then slowly, silently, she disappeared beneath the ice, leaving only a small gap of black, open water to mark where she had been. Within 60 seconds, even that was gone as the ice closed up again, and it all happened in 10 minutes. Shackleton that night noted simply in his diary that the Endurance was gone and added, "I cannot write about it." And so they were alone. Now in every direction there was nothing to be seen but the endless ice. Their position was 68 degrees, 38 and a half. What's the next
minutes?
Minutes south. 52 degrees, 28 minutes west. A place where no man had ever been before, nor could they conceive that any man would ever want to be again.
What did he say?
So 68,
Let's see.
38, 68 south, 52 west.
So, let's see. This is 10, 20, 30, 40, 50, 60, 68.
Didn't they say below the 60s?
Yeah.
There is no God, or below
the winds, yeah.
The winds.
So there's 68 by, what was the other?
52.
Yeah, so they're somewhere right in this area is where the ship went down. And they have some really good maps in the book that show you the rotation. So the ship got stuck here, and in all of that time, it flowed around here. And I wish I had remembered exactly how much time, but and finally disappeared at about this point. So the ice is just kind of sitting here floating and turning slowly. And that's what he was talking about. They're getting close to this little peninsula, and some days it would go directly this way. And they don't want that. They want this northwesterly direction to try and get to land.
Wasn't it January when they got stuck? Initially?
A year before?
I mean, and now it's November.
It was,
I think
it was close to that. Yeah. It was definitely close to that.
So they go on to the chapter 5 basically begins with them saying it's such a shock because that not having the sight of the ship, like that had kind of been their last tangible, they say tangible physical symbol that linked them to the outside world. So it's like this shocking sort of thing. If you have a book, there's, like Rob said, there's some great photographs. You can go online and find photographs that Hurley documented. So encourage you to do that for sure. How are we doing on time? 10.
Yeah.
Okay, 19 minutes. So they, it's interesting, if you read more, we're not going into a lot of the characters, or the humans, the people, but some of them were characters, in that sense of the word. It got nicknames for various reasons, but that's part of what people talk about with this group is that they found a way to
become brothers.
To become brothers and work together well. They talk about for Shackleton how even though he was friendly and tried to engage with the guys, he was always a little aloof because he was the boss. He was the one calling the shots. He had to make the decisions, and just that. And that could be a whole other leadership discussion.
Yeah. He also felt very responsible.
Right.
And he had gotten them there.
Right. And there is a challenge at one point, and that's where I realized that this is skipping ahead a little bit. But one of the older guys on the ship, he was 56, I think. And he is the one that kind of heads up the stores. But he, as they have finally decided that they have to start moving toward this other area, basically says, I'm not going to do this anymore. Like, I can't do this. Which, of course, they're like, what's he going to do? Like, walk off into Antarctica alone? And basically, he tries to pull out some legal talk that, that the loss of the ship absolved him of all obligations to obey orders that would have been true under ordinary circumstances. And you see that all the crew members had signed articles of loyalty to the Endeavour, and that sometimes they would end if the ship went down, but there was a special clause that had been inserted into the articles signed by those who sailed on the Endurance, quote, to perform any duty on board, in the boats, or on the shore as directed by the master and owner, Shackleton. And so the Shackleton reminds this gentleman of that, and then also takes the opportunity to say, hey, everybody, just want to remind you, this is what you signed up for. Not that they had a better option, but that was just interesting to learn. But they do decide they have to finally set off, and I think one of the more painful things for me to imagine is, I don't know the best verb, but trying to walk through this sludgy ice, not knowing. They talked often about how the ice could just, you think it was solid, and then you put your foot down and you're up to your waist or higher, and having to get out, or you come up to one of those one-story, shelves of snow that you're having to like stop and take time to like cut through to move, and so I think we have a few minutes where we could read just like the part. Let's see. So they're leaving the surface, and they say, at 3 a.m., the coldest time of the day. This is page 115 if you're in the book. At 3 a.m., the coldest time of the day, the surface of the ice was treacherous. A crust had frozen over the rotting, saturated floes, which is weird to think about ice rotting, but And on top of this, there was a layer of snow. The surface had a deceptively sturdy appearance, and at each step it would seem capable of supporting a man. But just as he shifted his entire weight to that foot, he burst through the crust with a jarring shock into the numbing water underneath. It was usually knee-deep, sometimes more. Most of the men wore heavy Burberry Durax boots, ankle-high leather boots with gabardine uppers reaching to the knee, designed for marching on hard ice. But as the party struggled over the slushy floes, these boots continually filled with water. In the soaked state, each weighed about 7 pounds. It was an exhausting exertion at every step to lift one foot and then the other out of 2-foot holes full of snowy slush. Of all the party, the worst off were the men pulling the boats, these 1-ton boats. Mm-hmm. They had taken 2 of them, the whaling boat and one of the others. The shock they suffered at each step was greatly increased by their burden. They could take only about 200 to 300 yards of such punishment at a time. So they would abandon that boat and walk slowly back for the second, trying to catch their breath along the way. Frequently, they would find that the sledge runners under the second boat, had frozen into the ice. There was nothing to do but slip into the traces, which the traces are what the dogs usually wore. And then, with Worsley counting, 1, 2, 3, go, they would make 3 or 4 violent, concerted lunges until the runners broke free. I mean, and so for hours on end, they would do this, and then they would look back. So this says, at 8 o'clock, after 5 hours on the trail, Shackleton signaled for a halt. They had covered a miserable half-mile. And that's, and they know they have hundreds of miles ahead of them.
Yeah.
And so I kind of think of that way where people say you just got to keep putting one foot in front of the other, yeah. I think some of you could probably tell stories about times of life where you just felt like, okay, I'm just, I got this heavy load. I'm just going to keep
blindly walking,
going, So we kind of get toward the end, and basically they what I just described, they do for a number of days, and then essentially they realize they have to retreat because the way they've been going is not going to work. And so even to think about that and what you've just put yourself through, and then we're like, oh, we gotta
go back.
I don't know if we could just finish, wrap up if you wanted to, because it talks about the disappointment they're feeling in Shackleton.
None of them, however, could possibly have felt their defeat so intensely as Shackleton, to whom the thought of quitting was abhorrent. He wrote in his diary that night, with characteristic peculiar punctuation, turned in but could not sleep. Thought the whole matter over and decided to retreat to more secure ice. It is the only safe thing to do. ... Am anxious. For so big a party and 2 boats in bad conditions, we could do nothing. I do not like retreating, but prudence demands this course. Everyone working well, except the carpenter. I shall never forget him in this time of strain and stress.
That's what he was, the carpenter.
Mm-hmm. The retreat began at 7 that night. They made their way back about a quarter mile to a fairly solid floe and pitched camp. All hands were called early the next morning. Most of the men were sent out to hunt seals, while Shackleton and Hurley prospected for a route to the northeast, and Worsley went with McElroy's team to look for a way to the south. Neither party found a route that was safe. Shackleton had noticed some breaking up of the ice around them. As soon as he returned to camp, he ordered the recall flag hoisted at once to summon the seal hunting parties. Then, once more, the party retreated, this time about a half a mile to a very flat, heavy floe. Even here they were not safe. A snow-filled crack was discovered in the ice the following morning, so they shifted camp about 150 yards toward the center of the floe in search of a fairly stable ice, but there wasn't any to be found. Worsley described the situation. All the floes in the neighborhood appear to be saturated by the sea to the very surface, so much that on cutting 1 inch below the surface of a 6 or 7 foot thick floe, water almost at once flows into the hole. But what disturbed them most was that they were trapped where they were. Greenstreet explained that it looks as if we can get no further, and we can't get back to Ocean Camp either, as the floes have disintegrated considerably since we passed over them. The following day was December 31st. McNeish wrote, Hogmanay, the Scottish feast of the New Year's, and a bitter one too. Being adrift on ice instead of enjoying the pleasures of life like most people. But as the saying is, there must be some fools in this world. James recorded New Year's Eve, the second in the pack, and in much the same latitude. Few people are having a stranger one. Macklin noted, the last day of 1915. Tomorrow, 1916 begins. I wonder what it will bring forth for us. This time last year, we prophesied that just now we would be well across the continent. Finally, Shackleton wrote, the last day of the old year. May the new one bring us good fortune, a safe deliverance from this anxious time, and all good things to those we love so far away.
It's kind of wild how eloquently they can write about these things.
They were definitely writers. We could do worse, right?
It struck me as you were reading that, I mean, I don't know, again, that he had any option, but that sometimes we see leaders in our world, like, we're just going to keep moving forward. We just got to keep going forward, whatever the cost, just kind of to save face a lot of times, or pride or arrogance or reputation, whatever it might be, or just a sense of being right. And, and so there's some lesson in that, like, probably his men would have picked, he would have walked them into peril, but that, okay, I mean, that's what he said, that we got to retreat, and that's what we got to do. And just
there's no safe course.
Oh gosh. I mean, just that description, and it just made me think about time. Actually, it was Hunter, our the pastor previously, who would sometimes describe situations when people felt like they were in a dark room, and there's no windows and no doors, and he would kind of say that, and like, you just need one little opening, and you just need a little light to come in, and
oftentimes that took others, so that's part of this fellowship, and hopefully we can dive into that, because that helps our endurance, our faith and seeing others.
We want to be encouraged.
So, hopefully that is encouraging.
We're about to wrap up we are wrapping up our hour. Might just say a quick prayer for a moment. We're thankful, God, that you give us time, you give us stories, you give us a sense of adventure, and that you are faithful in the ways that you, in all that you do, and that you love us, and you are proclaiming your love for us now. If we're reading this book, if we're not reading this book, if we're feeling courageous, if we're feeling defeated, if we are feeling right with you, if we're feeling off with you, whatever it might be, God, I pray that we are overwhelmed with your overflowing, abundant love. It looks like a father running after his son and his daughter, and to scoop them up and smile as you smile over us. So thank you that you remind us that, yes, there will be hard things in this world, but that you have overcome the world. Help us to rest in that as we build endurance, Lord, for your sake. We praise you, and ask this in Jesus' name. Amen.
Amen. Thanks, Redeemer.
Thank you. Peace.